right, hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. I've always wanted to do that. I'm not often on stages. Hello, Toronto. Hello, friends and colleagues. Welcome to the 2022 to 2023 Kenneth H. Peacock Lecture. It is my pleasure to serve as host and MC. I will invite first folks to move forward and get close so that we can feel proximate and have a conversation together if you'd like. Thank you so much for filling the front seats, graduate students. I really appreciate that. I will first just give you a sense of the event this afternoon. So our guest speaker will present the Peacock Lecture, followed by a brief period for a Q&A. And then following that, at 5 p.m., we will have a reception just here in the Walter Hall lobby. So you just walk up the stairs to servers putting grapes and wine and directly into your mouth. It'll be lovely. We hope that you can join for the reception from 5 to 6, so we can convene together and speak with our celebrated guest. All right, so I will begin by first acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. This is the past, present, and future land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I, like you, are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And it is now my sincere pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Kofi Agawu. And I am going to cheat and look at the bio that I was provided. Otherwise, I'm just going to tell personal anecdotes, and I'm not sure that's what Prof wants. Okay. Prof. Kofi Agawu was born in Ghana, where he received his initial education before studying composition and analysis in the United Kingdom, and then musicology in the United States. He is currently Distinguished Professor at the Graduate Center at City University of New York, otherwise known as CUNY. His books include Playing with Signs, African Rhythm, Music as Discourse, Representing African Music, and The African Imagination in Music. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Dent Medal, and the Harrison Medal. Prof. Agawu is a Fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as a corresponding Fellow of the British Academy and an honorary member of the Royal Musical Association. Gosh, golly, congratulations. Prof. Agawu has a collection of essays forthcoming with Oxford University Press, which I'm very excited about, entitled On African Music, Techniques, Influences, and Scholarship. Excuse me, I added an and. Techniques, Influences, Scholarship. That's much more classy. On a personal note, I'll add, so in addition to being a celebrated music scholar, Professor Agawu is widely adored and okay, I have to stop myself. Adored and beloved by colleagues and students. He's a very generous mentor to myself and many others, and it's a real pleasure to have him here in Toronto with us today. So, without further ado, Professor Agawu, thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was a very generous introduction. I want to say it's an honor for me to give this year's Kenneth H. Peacock Lecture. Thanks to Lindsay for persuading me to do this. And also thanks to the Dean of the School of Music, Professor Isama, for making me sign a contract to do this. In other words, for inviting me formally. And thanks to Professor Carol Clark for letting me sit in on her fascinating Orpheus seminar this morning. I should also acknowledge Julia Barber for handling the practical aspects of my trip. This is not my first visit to your School of Music. I was here, gosh, I don't want to think about it, but I think it was 2004. I had a good visit then, and I've had a good visit so far. I don't know whether things will be like that when you've heard me speak, but I'll just get on with my paper. So I begin with a question. What comes to mind when you think of African music? Is it the second one again? That was going to be number 2. The first one you heard, then there was a little confusion here. But here's the second one. Is it this, maybe? Or might it be this? So you can remember them 1, 2, and 3, right? Okay. So the first and third are probably familiar. Number 1 is a song from Guinea entitled Kalefa Ba. It features kora player Mbadi Kuyate and his wife singer Diariatu. Her voice reaches far, she enunciates clearly, her melody is affecting, and the performance as a whole summons the Monday cosmos. Number 3 is a popular Southern Ewe dance, Agbaja, from Ghana. It is an index of the communal ethos and polyrhythmic expression that binds singers and dancers and drummers together in collective action. But what about number 2, a solo piano piece with a strong interrogative quality? This piece lacks a consistent pulse, it invests in silence, it trades in fragmentary gestures, and essentially tells listeners, listen up, this is music to be contemplated. Is this also African music? Indeed, it is. I actually used the swear word there, but I will not read it. It is the music of Nigerian composer Joshua Uzoigwe, 1946 to 2005, a composer of great originality and enterprise, whose work displays the lineaments of post-colonial art music composition. Outing a secret. Now, if you did not know about music such as Uzoigwe's, you wouldn't be alone. For you see, a well-kept secret about Africa is the existence of a significant body of art music, music self-consciously composed by individuals, often notated, usually rehearsed and performed by skilled practitioners for non-participating or minimally participating audiences in designated modern spaces, churches, concert halls, community theaters, and private homes. The example you just heard, Ilulu, belongs to the genre of African pianism. For the composer, the piece is atonal and expressionistic. It is meant to, quote, create an atmosphere that portrays vagueness, tension, nervousness, and energy. Those are the composer's own words. And indeed, some listeners may be reminded of early 20th century European modernism. But Ilulu was composed in 1991, not 1911. And I chose that arbitrarily, but anyway, not 1911, but you know what the point I'm making. And it was first recorded in 2003 by Ghanaian-American pianist William Chapman-Yahu. And Uzrego is the guy on the left, Chapman-Yahu is the guy on the right, the pianist. So why do the major published sources of information on African music, including the periodical literature, routinely ignore this tradition of art music, a tradition that has been around since the 19th century? What accounts for its underrepresentation in the work of leading European scholars, Rouget, Kubik, Aron, and others? Scholars who have devoted entire lifetimes to the study of African music and oral literature. So I'll leave those as rhetorical questions for now. Yeah? But let me state the problem in a different way. If I were to present you with the names Ngugi, Ama, Shoinka, Achebe, Adishe, many of you will recognize them as leading African writers. Everyone has read the novel Things Fall Apart, a canonical work of African literary imagination. Yes, it is written in the language of our colonial oppressors, well, sort of, but it inscribes experiences, values, and beliefs that many readers readily identify with. It evinces a post-colonial worldview. If, on the other hand, I were to provide you with another list, this time with the names Showande, Labi, Yuba, Tamusuza, Kiagambedwa. Actually, this is probably an educated audience, so you'll all pass this one, but indulge me for now. But if I were to provide you with this second list, many of you will probably draw a blank. These are composers. Like their literary colleagues, they are attempting to exercise the African imagination, only this time in the medium of sound. Is there something about sound that impedes the circulation of their work? That seems unlikely. After all, artists like, I'm staying in just West Africa for now, Fela, Angelique Kidjo, Youssou N'Dour, Burna Boy, Wizkid, etc., have managed to attract a large international following from musical performance. Of course, they operate in the realm of urban popular music with its easy media-assisted circulation, not in the realm of art music. What accounts for the markedness of African art music? Well, be assured that I'm not here this afternoon to sing a song of lament, nor am I going to whine about what Euro-America knows, does not know, or more to the point, does not wish to know about certain African musical practices. Rather, I want to use the existence of what I'm calling a secret to reflect on the entailments of an art music tradition. I'll be suggesting that it is precisely the failure, perhaps even refusal, to come to terms with the realities of the post-colony that has impeded appreciation for a tradition whose historical emergence was inevitable, whose affordances for creativity are quite considerable, and whose symbolic value for African modernity is very high indeed. So now the tradition. Time doesn't allow me to tell the whole story of African art music in this talk, so I'll make brief mention of just two countries in which the tradition is thriving, Nigeria and Ghana. Art music owes its origins to the twin forces of missionization and colonization. Music played an important role in the realization of the goals of the missionary project, while colonial education provided avenues for the cultivation of musical interest through singing, playing of instruments, and in a few cases, composing. In his 1995 book on Nigerian art music, Wojo Mojola lists and discusses the work of composers like Achinuvu, Akpabot, Bankole, Ekweme, Yuba, probably the most prominent of them, Ndubuisi, Nzewi, Omojola himself, Sado, Showande, the father of African art music, and Uzoigwe, whose music we heard earlier. There are many more. And indulge me for actually mentioning these names, but I do that for a purpose, just in case you say, no, you never, that they don't exist, I just made it up, but I didn't. And just anecdotal, I'll tell you that if you've come across a book by Valentin Mudimbe called The Invention of Africa from the 80s, Valentin, as I call him, I hope it's okay, told me that when the book was first published, one of the ongoing responses was, I don't believe your bibliography. Because for the first time, people saw dozens and dozens of books and articles written by continent-based Africans having an internal conversation and debate about matters philosophical. And the only thing they thought was philosophical was a book by one of those missionaries. So anyway, sometimes it's worth mentioning names, even if it seems a bit pedantic. All right, let me go on. So it's the Nigerian, I mentioned a number of Nigerian names. There's no comparable single source for the Ghanaian story, but well-known figures like Ephraim Amu, Ramnan Ketia, N.Z. Nayo, Jimalavi, the late Ken Kafui, and George Dorr have been the subject of individual studies, including self-studies. And here I might just mention that Rajesh Ubabe, who's a Nigerian scholar right now at the University of Ghana, has recently compiled a database of African symphonism, he calls it. He found at least 14 symphonic composers in Ghana alone. There is also, on this bibliographic note, forgive me for being this didactic, Benjamin Zisch, in a 2017 dissertation from the University of Heidelberg, has identified 85 African composers and some 540 works. So anyway, there are other sources. Okay, so what kind of heritage do these composers possess? The first thing to note is that the heritage is multiple and eclectic. It stems from community-based traditional music, that is music with the strongest claims to being of pre-European origin, like the Agbaja, the number 3 dance that we heard earlier. It stems also from transformations of this tradition into new traditional forms. It also includes ubiquitous popular music of Cuban, American, and British origins. And perhaps most importantly for my purposes, it includes selected European repertoires, including hymns, simple classics, Gilbert and Sullivan operas, and a very limited encounter with music of the 20th century. Let me, for a moment, dwell on the European part of that heritage by citing a revealing but little-known source. I'm putting on my musicology hat here. The so-called tunes for the use of the seminary. So this was published in 1907 by the Basel Mission in Ghana, and it's aimed at Twi-speaking, Twi is one of the languages, Twi-speaking tutors and students of the Ekropon Seminary. Here on this slide, you can see on the right the title page to this collection. It consists of 125 tunes which served as a kind of musical Bible for students interested in the subject and profoundly influenced individuals like Amu, Ketia, Aro Dansu, all of whom attended or taught at the seminary and who later became composers. Three things stand out about this document of missionization. First, in assembling a musical diet for Africans whose souls were also being targeted for redemption, the Basel missionaries included work by only a handful of well-known composers like Handel, Mozart, Beethoven, and Mendelssohn, alongside numerous works by lesser-known composers with names like Klein, Nägeli, Becker, Stern, Voigtländer, Kreutzer, and others. Yeah, so a few well-known composers, many little-known composers. Okay. Secondly, the musical material consists of chorales, opera choruses, and excerpts from oratorios, all fitted with pre-words, not necessarily translations of the original text. One interesting exception, by the way, is the Hallelujah chorus from Messiah, which retained Handel's English text. But most interesting in the compilation are adaptations of secular instrumental melodies for this religious context. And I thought you'd like to see at least one item from this collection. I know you won't be able to read that, but just take a stab at the first line there. F major, by the way. Okay, let me make your life a little easier. And here is a transcription of it. Does anyone recognize this by me? Just out of curiosity. Yeah.
No, I do not.
No.
I just responded.
Does anyone recognize it? I'm not going to go on if you don't tell me what it is. Okay. The hint is that this is not the original key. All right, let me put you out of your misery. It's the theme from the slow movement of Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, and it's been here transformed into a hymn-like song and fitted with words, Nyamepa Yensru Eja, good God, let's fear the Lord. And by the way, if the topic, as in topic theory, if the topic of the Appassionata slow movement is a chorale, then what the Basel missionaries have done is simply to out the topic, cast it in a familiar light instead of the defamiliarized form that topics normally assume. And I mentioned this just parenthetically, that it's possible that studying the reception of certain idioms of European music in Africa will unearth some of its topical potential or some of its topical sediment. Anyway, that's the second thing about the nature of the material. Thirdly, the harmonic idiom is firmly tonal in the common practice sense of the term. Hierarchic structures anchored by a tonic-dominant polarity control the movement at phrase levels. Secondary dominants are used occasionally, but there are few extended modulations. African composers brought up in such a milieu later found it impossible to escape the regimes of syntax and vocabulary imposed by this music. Regimes, it must be said, that were initially antithetical to those of indigenous musical expression. The result was a form of colonization of musical consciousness. I want to now sample a few of these worlds. So I dwelt on the 1907 compilation, Seminary Tunes, because I believe that some such body of music lies behind the tonal thinking of many composers of Black African art music. It could be a hymn book, it could be music in a piano tutor, it could be music practiced by various congregations, and this is only the Protestant side of the story. But there is always some orienting or foundational document, and the one that I showed you is the one that the Basel missionaries imposed on the folks at Akropong. But exposure and training do not tell the whole story, however. We also need to take into account the choices made by individual composers. In other words, we need to consider composer agency. Again, in the interest of time, I will confine what I have to say here to just two kinds of evidence. You could call one visual and the other is oral. First, I will show you, without too much comment, a few pages of score from works by 4 composers. And then we will listen to brief excerpts from 3 works of African pianism. First, the visual evidence. So this is a page, this is actually a few bars from Jima Labi's Timpani Concertino. This is a work from 1993. It's written for an Ebe ensemble, 2 saxophones and timpani. The ensemble, the drum ensemble, has the usual bell pattern or timeline at the top there, various supporting drums. And then the melodic instruments, the saxophones, complement the mellow rhythms of the percussion, and timpani's patterns add to the rhythmic texture within their relatively restricted pitch capabilities. The music is polyrhythmic, and at this moment, the texture is busy with something happening on every 8th note, and maybe on many 16th notes. That's obviously good news for the counting of onsets industry. Here's a second example. Sorry, I meant that lightly. Here's a second example by Sheung Owaje. It's a piece called Expansions on Ajantala. It's from 2015. It's a dramatic work for voices and instruments. And if you look at the list in the left column, you'll see that the instruments represent various animals. In terms of the tone vocabulary, on that first page, the sort of whole tone configurations you can see. Then if we look on the second page, here are lots of clusters. We don't have time to go into any of this. It's kind of bad manners, to analyze music in public. But melodic lines here are constrained by spoken Yoruba, so the composer is juggling tonal and rhythmic constraints even while advancing the narrative. Then here's another example from 1944 by Ephraim Amo, Asimi Dika. This talk has got to be spoken. Maybe not taught this word, but anyway. This is a choral piece by someone who is regarded as a father of Ghanaian art choral music. And this page is taken from Felicia Sandler's new edition of the work. There's a website where you can look this up. So, welcome to the land of triplets. Actually, strictly speaking, it's not just 3s, but 3 and 2. Or 3 with 2, or 3 in the time of 2, but never 3 against 2. Not a cross rhythm, but an inter-rhythm. There is a dance underpinning, and this one I'll play for you. And this is a good example of African choralism, which is widespread on the continent. The melody here is constrained by speech tones and speech rhythm. So a little bit of counterpoint. And the point that I want to make here, which I'll come back to, is what I'm describing as a new pattern of co-presence among a work's parameters. So I don't know the last time you heard a piece with very simple harmonies, as you will hear in a second, but all animated by triplets in this way. It's that kind of co-presence that I'm saying accounts for some of the novelty in this music. Yeah. So let's hear this. Just to prepare you for it, it begins with 3 phrases, Asemi Dika, and then Ejumai Diye, and Obrai Dipo, and then we go on to a B section, and each of these is repeated, but let's listen to it. Ephraim Amo, 1944. I'll sing And here. So the cadence, which you don't know. Second part. It's here now. Sorry about that. Should have at least given you the cadence. You got it the first time, so you can supply it. And then finally, just a page of score from Uzoegu's Ilulu. This is the piano piece I played you at the beginning. Thought you might just like to see his hand. He wrote very large notes, so I had one of my students do something else with it. So this is what it looks like, if you're more familiar. That's just to give you a sense of what some of these scores by these African art music composers look like. I will go on. So even this glance at the notation will convey something of what composing in the post-colony entailed. Concerns with titles, with instrumentation and genres, with musical procedures in the domains of rhythm, harmony, melody, and style, all of them signifying multiply. I think this music is worth listening to, and I think it's worth analyzing even. All right, so now for the oral evidence. Here I'm going to play you just 3 brief excerpts from works of African pianism. In other words, they're all pieces of piano music. First, Jima Labi's Earth Beats from one of his so-called 5 dialects for piano. And to prepare you for this oral experience, let me just describe some of what's going on. The pounding fury of the opening soon yields to a more lyrical, Akan-flavored material. But the drama of that opening is unfinished business, and the composer will return to it from time to time in the work. But here is Labi's Earth Beats. Now for something slightly different is Bongani Ndodana, Brains, Flowers in Sand. Bongani is a South African composer. This, I think, offers a different kind of temporal experience, a non-linear experience perhaps, as if sounds were being projected into space. Muted utterances form amidst a circular doodling. piece by Akinwuba. Sorry, I'll go back to this Akinwuba piece, Igba Keri. Akinwuba is actually the inventor of African pianism. This is a lively composition that you'll hear, which to my ear sports a huge choreographic supplement. And I think a lot of West African art music actually lives here. So this is just a few seconds. If I can get my cursor to sit on it. Okay, you're not going to hear that. Maybe. All right. I actually planned it because it's very lively and would wake you up after that, after the Bongani. Okay, so there are literally hundreds and hundreds of such works in various genres. Chamber music, art songs, choral music, operas, including folk operas, orchestral music, etc. I doubt that any fair-minded critic would dismiss this music out of hand, or discourage people from listening to it, or deprioritize it in surveys of African music, or pretend that it does not exist when writing a history of music in the 20th and the 21st centuries. So why does the African art music tradition remain little known? That's the end of it's not the end of my talk, it's just the end of the show and tell part of the talk. I had to play these examples so that we can ground the discussion in some recently heard music. So there's nothing more coming, and so you have to look at me actually. So now, resisting African art music. Saul Bellow once famously said, quote, "When the Zulus produce their Tolstoy, we will read him," end of quote. There are many versions of this story, by the way. A parallel formulation would be something like, "When the Aves produce their Bartok, we will listen to him," end of quote. Lurking behind that seemingly innocent claim is skepticism about the abilities of others, those others being blacks, people of color, non-Western people. Choose your umbrella. If we take Saul Bellow at his word, the standard for measuring African art music's worth will be set by a member of the European avant-garde, and I will not name any names here. By these lights, pitch organization in African art music, for example, may seem conservative. Aspects of this music may seem displaced from the Euro-modern, as if the century from 1820 to about 1920 simply did not happen. By this argument, critics claim that African composers are writing music that has, as it were, been previously written. They are, in effect, rewriting the West's achievements, taking us back instead of forward. But to pursue this claim of a temporal displacement, you would have to imagine a linearity to European musical history that is non-existent. Yes, conventional narratives have it that tonal harmony, for example, became increasingly chromatic in the 19th century and reached a high point in the atonal music of the early decades of the 20th. But the aftermath of the 1920s, not only in jazz and blues, popular music, but in some styles of classical music, like minimalism and post-minimalism, could hardly be described as progressive complexification of harmony. What we witness instead are new patterns of co-presence among the parameters of a work. It is this recontextualization, which I mentioned earlier, that accounts for some of the novelty in African art music. And if we were in a seminar room, I would actually pause at this point and dwell maybe on that Amu example to try to show you where some of the novelty lies. So, occluding the post-colonial condition. So if the quality argument is, as it were, shall we say, porous, we must look elsewhere for explanation of our secret. Could it be a poor understanding of the very conditions of the musical post-colony? the complex layers of sedimented cultural and stylistic influences, and the values that shape the choices that are made subjectively by individual composers. If so, what we need is a thick description of the worlds that each individual composer inhabits. Again, such a construction would be beyond the scope of a short talk like this, but we might gain some insight from reflecting on three terms that are mainstays of post-colonial criticism. One is hybridity, a second is essentialism, and the third, I'll finish with that, is decolonization. And I just want to say the point here is not to define these terms comprehensively and assess their usefulness for critical discourse on African art music. That will be too big a project, but simply to enter a few notes and caveats, as I like to say. So, hybridity. Hybrid, according to the OED, is anything derived from heterogeneous sources or composed of different or incongruous elements. So central to post-colonial expression, or so the story goes, is hybridity. The interaction of elements of different, sometimes radically different provenance. At first sight, compositions such as labis or yubas or uzoegues may be described as hybrid. There are three problems with deploying that term, however. First is the implication that other compositions are non-hybrid or even pure, presumably the opposing term. Is uzoegues music beholden to hybridity in a way that Brahms's or Stravinsky's works are not? Well, to raise the question is to expose the fragility of the claim, for by the time you are done excavating the various topoi that animate the music of a Mozart or a Mahler, a Debussy or a Britten, a Stravinsky or a Kurtag, you'll probably become wary of the actual existence of non-hybrid musical material. I knew topic theory would come in handy one day, but that's what's giving us this kind of insight. The second problem is the failure to historicize hybridity instead of hypothesizing it. We need to follow the changing meanings of the interacting elements and grant that something judged to be hybrid in one time period may lose that aura in a subsequent period. The third problem concerns the pejorative associations of the term, the implication that it betrays some kind of divided consciousness. It is not at all clear that a composer who routinely combines 3 with 2 interrhythm, combines those rhythms with, say, authentic cadences and asymmetrical phrase construction, is plagued by any kind of divided consciousness. In language use, code switching comes naturally to speakers of a Creole language. The musical equivalent of linguistic code switching is a more elusive proposition, however, because the codes themselves bleed at their edges, relinquishing any autonomy they might possess. So, to imply that individuals are laboring under the yoke of competing allegiances because of the diverse origins of their materials is to mischaracterize this aspect of musical creativity. It is to erect borders where none exist. Essentialism, the belief in real essences. Another challenge to the reception of African art music is the reliance, sometimes overtly, other times covertly, on essentialist attributes. Let me approach this problem by way of an anecdote. I find my students prefer anecdotes to hard theory. So, one of my students at the University of Ghana told me of a visiting European composer who had gone to Ghana to run a composition workshop. He would constantly enjoin the African students to be themselves. He would say, be yourself. Now, when a European tells you to be yourself, when he seems to know in advance what sonic form that self should take, you might wish to be alert to a looming ideological imposition. For this particular instructor, the essentialized African sound is evidently rhythmic. And so, be yourself means write music that is rhythmically complex, where, incidentally, complexity is to be judged from a European perspective, a perspective that almost certainly excludes the subtle sedimentations of language in African rhythmic expression. An obstacle to the open reception of African art music thus develops from this desire to see Africans thinking African musical thoughts. I'm modifying as a remark by Ontonji there. A post-colonial perspective would reposition essentialism as a strategic choice. It would not deny those patterns of musical investment that history and anthropology have shown to be valid, but it would struggle against and indeed reject the undercomplicating of our lived experience. And finally, decolonization. So I've been urging a more nuanced understanding of the post-colony, but since coloniality and missionization are key historical enablers of African art music, I must, in closing, make a comment about recurrent calls for decolonization. Decolonization here presumably refers not to the discourse about music, we could have fun doing that, but not that, but to the discourse of the music itself, including the very structures that enable composition. So what would it mean to decolonize African art music? Now, historically, decolonization has typically engendered two kinds of reaction, one a turning inwards and the other a turning outwards. One turns inwards to reclaim indigenous territory, including indigenous knowledge and expression, presumably under a real or imagined threat from outside forces. Language and its associated thought systems are key vehicles for executing this turn. There's, however, a reciprocal turn to the outside, this outside carrying both spatial and temporal valencies. For if the point of turning inwards is to recover something lost, the ultimate test of that recovery is that it engender new, presumably more grounded forms of creativity. These new forms, in turn, are aimed at contemporary audiences. In addressing what we might call the post-colonial contemporary, then, the artist is simultaneously concerned with past residue and future prospect, as well as local and translocal reception. So decolonization is a bit messy, maybe not as straightforward as it may seem. A number of African composers have already taken steps in this direction. Uzoigwe, for example, well into his career, studied a set of Igbo tuned drums, okom, and extracted elements and processes from that study for use in composition. He was seeking to ground his work in an African sound field, not only affectively, but structurally. Similarly, Nketia in the 1940s drew inspiration from the dirges sung by his grandmother in Mampong Asante to produce new music, music with aspirations to transcend the local while also addressing a contemporary imperative. So it would not be an exaggeration to say that African composers have been engaged in modest decolonial acts. These tentative steps typically take an incorporative stance rather than a separatist one. So instead of imagining an art music tradition purged of ostensible European influence, that's simply a chimera, African composers have sought change from within, transforming existing materials and practices, the things they came to meet, in response to new awakenings. It's all a gradual process. Finally, it bears repeating that Europe's desires for decolonization are shaped by its histories and the experiences of its actors. So even if the underlying impulses resonate with Africa's, we must not assume that we share the same goals. So instead, for example, of exporting Europe's neuroses, and you really have to stop exporting your neuroses, but instead of exporting Europe's neuroses about its influential figures to the erstwhile colonies, we might allow those who wish to creatively appropriate things tagged as colonial, including Beethoven, to do so, especially when such appropriation seems obviously empowering. In making this concession, notions of whiteness or Europeanness will not be wielded as self-evident categories when it comes to creativity. Creative practices are fields of possibility, shared by others, fields that may be tagged with different colors, black, brown, yellow, etc. In this way, African composers will not be cast into a defensive mode when it comes to justifying their work. They will not be sent on a wild goose chase seeking to identify ostensibly non-white spaces that they can call their own, spaces that are thought to be different. They will read the injunction to be yourself pragmatically and opportunistically. So, in short, the cat is actually now out of the bag, right? The African art music may not have attained the degrees of salience achieved by popular music or traditional music, but its composers are thriving within a pluralistic soundscape. This music's potential is enormous, comparable perhaps to the potential of African literary and theatrical production that has proved seminal to the discourses of post-colonial theory and world literature. It may in fact be that as calls to action, post-colonialism inscribes a different set of priorities from decolonization. The futures imagined by post-coloniality tend to provincialize Euro-America, whereas those associated with decolonization remain fixated on pasts denied by Europe. Yeah, that may be a little controversial, but we can talk about that. The distinction is not absolute, of course, but it points to different priorities. So the African art music tradition that I've described in this talk has, since the 1840s, sought to inscribe a modernity that has been undergoing constant redefinition. The tradition is dynamic. I hope you will agree that it is worthy of the attention of performers, listeners, composers, and perhaps even a few music theorists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Agawu, for an unsurprisingly eloquent and funny and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you. We now have a moment, if that's all right with you.
Yes.
For discussion, ideas, exchange, questions, and comments from the audience. I have this wireless mic here that I can pass to you. I will share it, or you can speak with gusto. So I invite thoughts and questions from the audience. I will start us off to break the ice. I understand that you were recently in Ghana, I think on a visiting professorship. I'm wondering if you might tell us, those of us who are unfamiliar, about the reception of West African art music, let's say, amongst university communities in West Africa, in, let's say, Accra, Legon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, just very briefly, in the music departments, whether it's Legon, Winnipeg, Cape Coast, they're all doing it, so to speak. I mean, it's there, they know about it. The choral stuff is very, very popular. And, you know, those with even modest skills playing piano and so on will play some of this. If you're asking about its salience, to the extent that one can measure salience, I would say, you know, art music doesn't stand a chance when you're, you know, distributing, you know, a zillion MP4s and all the radio stations are blaring this. If that's the kind of salience one is talking about. But In terms of its presence, it's there. I think there's a very wide range of styles represented, a wide range of skills. I mean, there are others here who can speak to other African countries, but just one little thing. So it's, again, you have to forgive me for having used Africa in this paper, but if I start to qualify what I mean by Africa, we'll be here all day. You know? So don't get upset if you're from Eritrea and I didn't mention Eritrea. I know that happens sometimes. But there's one distinction, though, that it seems to me to be important, which is South African art music seems to be a tradition of its own. And I recently came across an article by Stephanus Muller, who's at Stellenbosch, who said, the term African art music is usually applied to West African composers. So he's a South African who is recognizing that their art music somehow has a slightly different referent. Well, that's because of the particular history that they have. And so their art music, in a sense, has more aspirations to be part of the European canon, I think it's fair to say, than the kinds of ambition that African art music composers have. There are subtle distinctions, but yeah.
No, thank you. I was thinking about your comments, the conclusion of your paper about envisioning an art music composer, an African art music composer who's self-conscious and that they're creating self-conscious compositions that are self-consciously composed, in your words, but also self-consciously post-colonial. And I think you had a phrase in there about serving an audience or serving a community in the way that Burna Boy pleasures the masses, both in West Africa and abroad. Yes, that's interesting then to think about composers in South Africa perhaps serving an audience abroad, and West African composers seeking to serve a local audience.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a neat distinction like that, because there are West African composers who want to be played in Carnegie Hall, who want to be played in the Royal Albert Hall, and so on. So it's never a neat bifurcation of ambition, but there is, to me, a quite firm line between the South African situation and, say, the West African situation. Part of it is also just the resources that are available. What does it mean for a Michael Blake, for example, who's a South African composer, to have become a composer as a white South African, growing up in all the sort of European resources? It's a little different, I think, from the path that, say, Annie Yuba would have followed. So, yeah.
Okay, enough of me talking. Others, please, questions, comments? Yes, would you like the mic? No.
Yes, I'm good. So thank you for the lecture. I come from Brazil, and I've been studying Brazilian composers. And there's a very common argument over there, especially in the first half of the 20th century, but it goes on, that there would be limitations to the milieu, to the environment, that wouldn't afford a composer to become a real composer in the great tradition. And I would like to know if this is something that happens, like in Africa, in African countries. Like, for example, just to give a brief example, there was a Brazilian composer who was trying to get into a contest in Europe, a composition contest, and he was talking with, writing a letter to a German musicologist about it. And then he said, "Oh, I'm over the age because it's for composers under 30, and I'm 32." And the guy would tell him, "No, write them and say that for a Brazilian composer in his 30s is like a European composer in his 20s. So he could participate." Which is,
yeah.
And I would like to know if it makes any sense, if it resonates somehow.
Well, we would just cut down our age, that's all. Understate the age. Yes, I want to say that there is a thriving discussion about, what is different, from European composers about African composers, because it's not everyone who aspires to be a Mozart in the sense, not just of producing the kind of work that Mozart wrote, but having a kind of influence and so on, supported, you know, by various institutions and that sort of thing. I think people are very aware of, if you put this in a global context, people are very aware of the modesty of the resources. You know, and I hesitate to say that because these things are always contextual. You know, all the composers that I'm talking about here, none of them is a full-time composer. None of them made a living from composing. They're all university professors teaching counterpoint and harmony and so on. That's how they earn their living. Then they go home at night and write their music. So, just in terms of the availability of time to exercise that labor, I mean, you think of, I don't know, Haydn in the 18th century, you know, who's just, you produce one symphony tonight and then the next night after, you know, your poor can be do another one and that sort of thing. Those kinds of conditions, if like the conditions for the production of all this music differ significantly. So I don't think we should confuse the differences as such. That is why sometimes, you know, the discussions of sort of global aspiration, really we tend to, I think, undercomplicate the conditions. So one of the things I was trying to stress here in the paper is just, let's look at the peculiar situation of the post-colony, you know. What schools did they go to? What churches did these people go to? What jobs did they get? What languages did they speak? Now that's something that people, you know, Europeans don't want to talk about that. But that's a massive influence on the kinds of melodies that people write and so on. And just to dwell on that for a second, I mean, everyone knows about this, that, you know, there are all these tone languages that composers work with, but you would be surprised to see how deeply committed some composers are to the constraints imposed on melodic writing by the tone languages. They would think that if you wrote a melody that was doing something different from what the spoken language asked you to do, you were lying. You had to be arrested, you know, for violating this. Now, that's maybe putting it a little hyperbolically, but that kind of constraint is not greatly appreciated. You wonder, well, why is this melody only using these 3 notes? You know, probably the language is exercising a strong constraint. So, even finding the right parameters by which you can make these comparisons can sometimes, I think, be challenging. But so, yeah, to come back to your original question, I would say that there are, I mean, the composers who do African art music are working within their own milieu. If they get, you know, if they get a commission, Labi, for example, has had commissions in Europe, has had commissions in the US, you know, they get something played, but I don't think that they're primarily positioning themselves in, you know, in the sphere of the, well, certainly not with the avant-garde. It's a different kind of thing. I think, and one last thing, and then maybe there are other people who want to weigh in, but Akin Yuba, who was a major figure in the African art music tradition, passed away a few years ago. He preferred, towards the end of his life, to speak of interculturalism in music. And he wanted to see bigger alliances made, not with Europe, but with Asian composers, with Latin American composers. He thought that our experiences were more alike, you know. And there are other people who, you know, who believe that those kinds of alliances could be productive, or that they spoke to similar sorts of historical experience than, you know, always looking at, you know, the European canonical composers. So, yeah, I don't know. Does anyone else want to speak to this point? Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your paper. I especially appreciate the historical intervention, but I want to set that aside for just a second and sort of follow a little bit on Federico. Interestingly enough, I also do my research in Brazil. So one of the things that has come out, and I work on popular music too, so to put everything on the table, but one of the things that I see a lot in my work and sort of thinking about legacies of colonialism and things like that. It very often has less to do with sort of the music itself, quote unquote, and sort of deeper implications of, for instance, criteria of evaluation or discourses about music.
Mm-hmm.
And so sort of following on what Federico was talking about, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, so for instance, you mentioned that these composers work at universities, so that suggests a certain kind of class position. And then the presence of the university obviously is kind of a colonial legacy itself. And this is the kind of thing that CEO Fala Adam maybe has said, if one of the things that you hear a lot is music that gets evaluated positively by middle class audiences, for instance, in Brazil, is going to be harmonically complex, poetically introspective. It sort of has, and I think about all this through an old article that I read by musicologist Kenneth about covert musical values, and sort of putting a finger on sort of these underpinning legacies of value that may be covert or actually may be overt. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe some of those debates. A lot of your talk seems to be kind of looking outward and speaking to the metropole. Mm-hmm. But if you could sort of bring it back and talk about some of the debates that may be happening in different nation states in Africa, I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, that would be a multifaceted discussion. I want to say first of all that just talking about music, people have better things to do than just do that. and I don't mean that in this kind of self-deprecating humor here. But yes, of course, at the universities when they have classes, they do talk about this music, they debate it. But think about all the Protestant churches, that are writing anthems Sunday after Sunday for all the feast days and so on, using essentially 18th century harmony. Occasionally you'd be lucky to get a chromatic pitch in there. Flat 7, as you heard in the album, right? But for the most part, no. And if you're going to go, you should go to the flat side. Don't go to the sharp side. That's a pepper. But they're doing this, and they've been doing this since the middle of the 19th century. They're not holding meetings to decide, well, should we not be decolonizing ourselves and ridding ourselves of this stuff, these harmonies that some of them, improvise quite naturally. They hear a melody, they know what the alto part should be. Yeah, it can be interesting sometimes, but this is very much a part of these congregations, these music makers. So there isn't. It's when the scholars go in there, or sometimes the outsiders, who absolutely cannot stand that because, they want to go to the village square and see somebody doing fancy rhythms on a drum, right? It's better. It is when they come in that we start to inflect the discourse and we start to bring in some of these value things. But it actually makes no difference to these music makers. For the most part, I don't want to say it's an absolute thing. So, and if you consider that the musical worlds that we're talking about are so varied in their configuration, you will then maybe exercise a little bit of restraint about making sort of general, claims about the place of art music. So I'm chastising myself here now for giving a paper like this. But yeah, I guess I would say that this is an issue. I remember actually once in Cape Coast, somebody told me, this whole business of tonality and so on, the people on the streets couldn't care less, They do the thing they'd like. Oh, and here's one that you'll appreciate. There was a time I was making an argument about tonality and its colonizing potential, and somebody in the audience said, it's the people trying to do art music. They're the ones who are having trouble because they don't have as much control over their harmonies because they've been told don't write parallel fifths. All the music around them is full of parallelism, right? So they're the ones suffering. He said, the people in the popular realm, popular music, it sounds good to them, they do it. Because they don't know any rules as such, at least not those kinds of debilitating rules. So they look for something empirically, and it sounds appealing, and they do it. So this person was just basically saying, confine your discussion to the handful of those, people who have nothing better to do than to be trying to value these things and create, hierarchies and claim that these are of colonial origin. The other thing is this too, that, and Femi Taiwo has just written a book on against decolonization. And one of his big points is we should restore African agency to this discussion. So you can feel sorry for people, for resolving a dominant 7 to 7, but you can say, well, no, don't do that. We did that in Europe and we stopped doing that. So don't do that. But he's saying, well, allow some agency here. What are these people doing this, for? And they're doing it. It sounds good to them. They enjoy it. It satisfies them. So leave them alone, essentially. And so that kind of complicates things too, Now, you can put yourself in a different place and say, well, but I know better. I know, there's some essence there that I would like you to bring out, and I know it's not in the dominant 7th, it's in something else. You can delude yourself into thinking that. So these lines I find it's all very, very complicated. The more I think about it, the more I talk to people, and yeah. So I hope at least that we don't settle for some of those easy things. I think the creative realm is a very fluid realm, And just as you were saying, some of the boundaries that we draw neatly, when we make claims about ideologies and value and so on, they kind of disappear in the act of creation, so to speak, or at least within certain kinds of creative milieu. So, yeah.
We have a question here from Prof. Nassim Nitnas, and then I see Professor Josh Pilzer. And I've changed my mind. I think it would be great if we could speak into the mic, both for accessibility and also those watching on YouTube. So we'll pass the mic from Nassim.
Thank you, Professor Agawu. Your talk really resonated with me. I'm a former pianist from Iran, so I've been going through similar conversations. So I have 2 questions. Please feel free to respond to them or not. My first question is about, you've paid respect to, I'm also coming from music education, so I'm not a musicologist or music theorist. I wonder, you paid respect to some of the composers that are coming from the continent. I was wondering if there are any women composers in that conversation, and you've just mentioned agency. In the literary art of books coming out of the continent, there are a lot of women. I was wondering if that conversation is in parallel to its art music as well. So that's my first question. The second question, I'm going to say it very simplistically, so I apologize. So there has been quite a cultural shift since 2020 about rethinking our programming in higher education in music, and we need to bring more diverse cultural backgrounds, racial conversations, and all the above. Within your research, within your conversation today, what would you recommend to these programs? How can they take shape? Because, for example, in music, in my discipline, when we say, okay, let's play Iranian music, they mean definitely just some boomy, local Iranian instruments music, rather than there are all sorts of music happening, all sorts of music scenes are there. Can we mention all of them rather than just single idea of what you think of us? So, in at least North America, what would you say in that, just simplistically music programming, and how to differently give it a shape, rather than Ghanaian drumming, for example, or like Iranian tar? Like, there are more things happening. So, apologies for my 2 questions.
No, those are very fair questions. I think it's fair to say that an overwhelming number of art music composers is male, and this is for various reasons, having to do with who occupies these positions. Many of these people will have had organ lessons, say, as children, who then developed some interest in music, started to write music. But if we so yes, I don't know what the numbers are. I wish I could give you numbers. On the other hand, there's a very large number of female music makers, So there's a lot of traditional music that is in the hands of women, whether in mixed ensembles or just, women leading things, leading ensemble music making. I'm stumbling here because I wish I could just pull out a whole set of figures and tell you, but I'm quite certain that an inventory that you make, for example, the Ubabe inventory of the symphonists in Ghana, there are 14, they're all male, for example. I haven't looked at the other one that I mentioned with 540 works, tagging male, female. But even in South Africa, you'll find that they're largely male. So that's a historical situation that we can spend time trying to understand, and if we want to begin to inflect it in some way, depending on what situation you're in. Your second question is a little bit more challenging about what I would recommend, because unlike you, practical music education is, some of us have positioned ourselves so that we don't have to make those recommendations. But I say that because, we are let me put it this way, there are too many people giving advice on things. I know this as an African. One of our problems is that everyone is always giving us advice about what we should do. Okay, so you were not asking about the African situation, but for the Western Academy, I think you have to confront what it is that you are wanting to diversify and why. And you have to. The first thing is that you have to have an honest conversation about these things. I think there's a lot of begrudging revision of syllabi today, which will evaporate in no time, because there is no real commitment to the basics of the thing. It is, sorry, I don't mean this as a huge generalization, and I certainly don't know what you do here, so don't think that I'm pointing any fingers. But if the cup fits, but I think there's a lot of sort of misunderstanding of what it is that animates these traditions and what we might do in response. For example, it seems to me that if you want to do something with Africa, it should be performance-based, And it doesn't have to be a drum ensemble. You have a drum ensemble here, that's good. It doesn't have to come, from just the one kind of canonical drama ensemble. But it's the songs that people sing, It's the languages that they speak. Now, where is the commitment to language, which I keep coming back to? None whatsoever, So changes of the sort that we're imagining to diversify curricula could be quite radical. They would be long-term things. They wouldn't be the token things so that we can tick off a box, but rather we would ensure that the language-based tonality thing that I was talking about would become meaningful for people, not just as a kind of theoretical abstraction. So yeah, that's why I don't get into the direct policy thing, but I know that the discussion is going on. I think part of the problem, I was afraid that this would come up because it's on everybody's mind, Part of the problem is that there are different levels of commitment, let's put it that way. And I think there's a kind of anxiety in certain sectors, fear, there is a reticence about openly discussing these things, and that's I don't know how you can build something really solid in the future if you don't, have the right sort of attitudes, if you like. Yeah, sorry. I mean, okay. I mean, there are probably other people, who would want to weigh in on some of these efforts to introduce other things. But so maybe later on we can talk some more.
Well, first of all, Professor Agawu, thank you very much for your talk. I've followed your work ever since I began in graduate studies, including a very embarrassing moment of trying to introduce myself to you in Bloomington, in 1998, I believe, when I almost folded my tent and ceased to be a musicologist/ethnomusicologist, but I stuck it out, and it's wonderful to see you speaking here today. I have a lot of questions, but I'm actually more interested in African art music than I am in all of the reasons why the West is strategically ignorant about Western art music or African art music. And so and the one word that really struck me in your presentation, which I think really hones in on the kind of complexity of influences and subjectivities and musical materials all colliding in these works, is the word co-presence. So I just wanted to ask you to elaborate on that word and in terms of what is it musical materials that are co-present, is it histories that are present, is it subjectivities that are present, and is it consciousnesses, split subjectivities, whatever. Anyway, I just wanted to invite you to say more about co-presence. So.
Yeah, you probably have more developed understanding of it than I do. What I know is what I said. I meant the example I gave was a relatively simple example of musical, if you like, musical parameters interacting in a certain way. And I was, teasing you. I said, well, I don't know the last time you heard something with these harmonies, with these many triplets, for example. So if you're just pulling out those ingredients and say kind of triplet-dominated rhythmic texture with this dance underpinning, but these simple harmonies with certain strategic infelicities in the harmonies, or at least, if you compare them to standard, standard European common practice, conventional ways in which you treat a 6/4 chord, for example, these would seem, not right, so to speak. But if we approach these things with a little more care and say, well, this is what the composer wanted, and yes, maybe he only had 2 years of harmony, but he's written this thing, and this is what he's come up with, and actually it is quite interesting. Then we're getting somewhere, I think, with a better thing. But anyway, my point was simply that if you look at what happens within individual parameters, and you say, well, the rhythm here is actually very sophisticated, we can't quite do that, but look at the harmony, the other one doesn't quite do, and so on. But if we accept, first of all, as legitimate, because it has to be, and then as revealing of certain priorities of the individual composers, then these different kinds of co-presence, or these different patterns of co-presence, become illuminating. That's really as far as I've gotten in terms of thinking about this. So, but I can well imagine a whole bunch of works where there are differential. Again, you can't do this without sounding, so like you have some scale in front of you. But what I mean is that there are differential levels of, let's just say, commitment to elaborating the individual parameters. I had a conversation once with Nketia, who is probably known to some of you, musicologists, but you may not know that he was also very active as a composer. And in fact, towards the end of his life, wanted to be better known as a composer than the thousands and thousands of words that he had written. Well, he just wanted to be better known, but anyway. But he said, you know, there was a composer's workshop, and somebody asked him, so this tonality thing that you use, you know, this kind of simplified tonality, you know, why do you keep doing it, you know? And he said he didn't want to bother with that part of the music because there were other things that were calling his attention. He was writing his own lyrics. He was concerned about, you know, the melodic lines and so on. So if you have a ready tonal resource that you can use, you know, why not? We were not satisfied with that answer because we thought somebody as enlightened as him ought to probe or ought to be disturbed by the kind of the legible foreignness of tonal harmony, you know. But that's all. For him, it was a straightforward thing. He didn't want to bother. He had, you know, something he could work with a language he could work with. So, yeah.
There might be a moment for a final question or thought. Anecdotes seems to be popular. Joshua, David, yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering if you could just elaborate a little on you talked about, my question really is about African lived experiences around some of these composers and how that sense of, like I said, the experiences of being there as Africans and being quote unquote on the other side as Western composers. The sort of complexity that involves in the work and again in how that is transported in Western scholarship.
Yeah. Again, this is a slightly difficult question because the division that implies, you know, that when Akinyuba is, you know, having his string quartets performed, then he dons a European identity, and then when he's doing his dundun, then he is in Africa land or Yoruba land or whatever it is. That's okay for a certain kind of, you know, listing of ingredients when we do our scholarly work, you know. But it really is, I mean, the lived experience part of it is much more complicated than that. This is part of what I'm suggesting, that these dividing lines, as far as I can tell, and the kind of freight that they carry, these do not support the binaries that we just facilely introduce into the scholarship, you know. So there are people who get their tonal, stick with harmony for some reason. That's really just like one of the, you know, core parameters, or at least, you know, that's what the Europeans said. We have harmony, but you guys don't have harmony. And so we're always looking to see what they have. But if you take something like harmony, it's just not clear to me the extent to which it remains a foreign resource. I'm talking about, you know, regular functional harmony. Its foreignness has, for many people, ceased to exist. You know, 150 years later, you've been going into, you don't live that long, but you know, this is the tradition that your parents, your grandparents, and so on, you know, belong to. When did it become foreign? And at what point are you going to grant that it's no longer foreign? It's become local. It's, you know, it's been appropriated and being used, and people are moving on. They're not looking back. Yeah. So I don't know. My answer to that would be I don't know just where these boundaries exist. If you're saying that there is a concert of the Goethe Institute in Accra and they're doing African art music, and all the, you know, the people who work in the consulate offices come there to come and hear a little bit of that. Yeah, well, that happens, you could say, yes, the audience there will include many foreigners who are curious to see what African composers are doing. Yeah. So if that feels like a European occasion, then yeah, we can call it that. But that same composer is going to go home and eat fufu that night, and, or maybe, you know, go to a nightclub and dance to Davido or one of these. You know, these lines just, I don't understand why we continue to draw them. Maybe I've undercomplicated that point a little bit, let's say. Yeah.
We can complicate things over wine and other refreshments that are awaiting us in the lobby, thanks to Kenneth H. Peacock. So before we retire for conversation at the reception, please join me in applauding our guest, Professor Kofi Agawu. Thank you.